Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining today's session. I'm Rachel Johnston, the BWC TTA Program Manager. Our next session is about understanding the federal procurement process with Michael Williams and John Markovic.
Great. Okay, I can start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Williams from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. First of all, I just want to thank John and BJA for inviting me to speak to you about the procurement process on, using federal grant funds. This will not be an extremely long presentation, but there will be some what I consider valuable information or takeaways for you to get from this presentation in reference to procurement. I want to start off by saying that even though we're talking about the federal rules for procurement, an agency should have its own established policy and procedures for procurement. And again, based on those requirements from the grant program or the solicitation, you just want to make sure that that information or those requirements and rules are also a part of your agency's policy and procedures for procurement when we're talking about federal grant programs. So this session, again, is about procurement or understanding the procurement process. All right, so as I started off by talking, I said that, states and non-federal entities or any entity should have its own policy and procedures when we're talking about procurement. So I want to expand on that. So an agency should have its own policy and procedures or should be following its own policy and procedures for every aspect of the grant, not just procurement. But again, that's what this particular presentation will focus on. So again, if an agency has its own policy and procedures, I would like to say that they're probably more restrictive than the federal government. So technically what you should be using is the agency that provides the best or the most efficient protection for those federal grant dollars. And here's what I mean by that. In most cases, or let's talk about federal equipment. So when I think about federal equipment, I have on my federal hat. So the definition or the federal definition for equipment is equipment must have a useful life of more than 1 year and then have a market value of at least $5,000. Now, in some cases, depending on the size of your agency, you are kind of having the same definition for equipment in reference to the first part, that equipment must have a useful life of more than 1 year. But depending on the size of your agency, the acquisition or the fair market value of that equipment is probably something less than the $5,000. It could be as much as $750, maybe even $1,000. So when I say you want to use the policy and procedure that is more restrictive, an agency that has a policy and procedure for something that is less than the federal definition, then you want to follow that. In some cases, I've talked to grantees that was actually using two policies, and you want to stay away from that. They were trying to follow the federal guidelines for the policy and procedures and then their own agency. So again, just one policy and procedure, but again, use the one that's most, and I'll use that term restrictive, that you will be able to better protect that federal equipment. The most important thing is documentation. Okay, normally an auditor will say is that if you don't have adequate or supporting documentation, then that transaction, the way that they look at it, technically does not exist. So again, you want to have supporting documentation, sufficient documentation, and that documentation should tell a story about whatever that procurement item is. It should provide what I consider an audit trail so that anyone that picks up that documentation for that equipment can run through a process of understanding, for example, where it was originated at, the purchase order for that, whether it was approved by those particular officials that are required to sign off and approve the purchase of any type of equipment, And then again, that whole process of receiving the equipment, maintaining the equipment, being able to track that equipment, and then ultimately disposing of that equipment when you no longer have a need for that equipment. So again, documentation is very, very important. All right, so when we're talking about federal equipment, the most important thing to keep in mind is what the actual rules and regulation says. In any type of purchase of equipment, you want to be able to let the market do what it does best. And based on that, that is competition. So any type of procurement that you put out based on whether we're talking about small purchase or a larger purchase, it's always best to let the market do what it does best, and that's competition. I think that by doing competition, you'll get a wider range of offers for various types of equipment that you're purchasing, and then be able to determine what would be the best value for your particular agency. So again, based on the uniform guidance, it requires that all procurement transactions be done in a manner that provides full and open competition. So that means, again, like I said, allowing the market to do what it does best by getting all of these bids or bids in for your particular product, being able to evaluate them to see where you're getting the best bang for your bucks, and then that way you're able to make an informed decision as to what the actual procurement item will be. Always important to maintain a bidders list, because now, even though we're saying that you want to make sure that you do a full and open competition, you still need to maintain a bidders list, because you want to make sure that regardless of what the item is, based on your bidders list, you're able to make sure that those vendors that would be most qualified for whatever that transaction is or that procurement is, they are part of the people or entities that's getting that information for what you're looking for in reference to equipment. So they say that whether we're talking about newspapers or some type of advertisement, the idea is to get that particular solicitation out there on the street, and hopefully for as long as you can keep it out there for, in order to get the widest range of people to respond to your particular solicitation when you put it out there. So again, procurement transactions must be conducted in a manner that limits what we call local preferences. Now, keep in mind, even though this is something that the federal government would like to see happen, again, depending on where your agency is located, your only resource would probably be a local preference. And I'll give you an example. If we're talking about territories, Puerto Rico or Guam or something like that, then based on that, you would expect them to use local preferences and putting those solicitations out there, keeping the economy going based on where they're situated at. But, if that's not the case, then you want the widest range of bidders to bid on that particular solicitation. Now, there may be a case, based on the last bullet, where that you are authorized to use local preference. So again, if that's the case, you'll want to make sure that you get approval from the federal agency in order to do a local preference for any solicitation that you put out there. So with this particular slide here, we're talking about sole source, okay? I don't want to say that the agency, the federal government, frowns on sole source, but sole source is another alternative for procurement. There are some limitations for utilizing sole source, and as you can see that the federal awarding agency would need to approve a sole source that's over $250,000. Now, there are cases when sole sources are the going method or way in order to do that. So for here, you'll see if the item or service is only available from one particular entity, okay? Now, if that is the case, then we would want to know how that determination was made. How do you know that there's only one vendor that's capable of providing this service or these particular items? And in some cases, don't get me wrong, that will be the case, but you just need to be able to justify to the awarding agency that that is the case. If there is a true emergency in order to get this particular item and or service up and running as soon as possible. To give you an idea of what we consider a public emergency, let's look at our current weather where we're dealing with tornadoes and things of that nature. In order for an agency or a location that has experienced some type of devastation based on a storm, it probably wouldn't be feasible to put a solicitation out there on the street in order to get bids, in order to rebuild a particular community. So that would be something that's an emergency that you put out there, and that's not going to be out there that long. But as bids come in, then now you're able to move forward. And again, it could be the case where it's a sole source, because the first responsible entity that replies to that probably would be the one that you would award that particular contract. And then if you're doing competitive bidding, which is the preferred method, if you do that, based on all of the responses that you receive, you find out that it's still not sufficient or adequate enough in order to move forward. So then you would, again, deal with one particular entity based on the sole source. When we're dealing with sole source, the federal government requires that there is justification prior to doing a sole source. This here that I'm getting ready to share with you, keep in mind that it's only a sample of what the federal agency would be looking for and in order to sign off and or approve a sole source justification. So there should be a description of the program and what product is needed for that particular contract, okay? Number two, you would need to explain why it is necessary to go non-competitive or sole source, okay? So some things that we'll be looking for is the entity, the organization's expertise in that particular field, okay? Management's knowledge or capability of doing things in a timely manner could be another thing. It could be something that this particular entity is knowledgeable of the actual program. The only thing that I want to talk about here about when we talk about the knowledge of the program, that may be the case for, let's say, a year or two, but then after that, you would want the organization to go out to see whether or not that there is someone else. You don't always want to rely on the fact that they know the program, and naturally they would know the program after working on that particular program for multiple years, but that doesn't mean that they're the best vendor for that particular service, okay? Responsiveness and the expertise of the individual employees of that particular firm. Then one of the things that a lot of program officers are looking for now, or they rely heavily on it, is that if you're saying that this is a sole source and this is the only entity that's capable or able to provide this service or these resources, then what type of market survey was performed to determine that that is the case? And then, as you can see, some offices will require that if there is no survey performed, then why wasn't a particular survey done in order to support the sole source justification? Another very important feature with the sole source justification is that based on an entity that you have selected in order to do this particular procurement. If you're able to explain that based on, and again, I'm going to go back to something I said early on the other slide about the knowledge of the program, that if you could convert that into, and I'll use this term, dollars, equate it into dollars, that this is what it would take in order to bring another vendor up to speed, the time that you would lose, the additional money that you would have to expend to bring another vendor up to speed. It is believed that if you can equate that in dollars and show the program office why you went sole source on that particular item, then that provides more support in reference to going sole source. Then any other points to sell the case that you can think of that would be beneficial in order to get the funding source to truly understand why you're choosing this particular vendor. And then anything from that, you want to make sure that in wrapping up, that it's always in the best interest of the awarding agency or the federal government to move forward with this particular entity that you've chosen. Also with the sole source justification, you want to make sure that you address a conflict of interest, whether it's the actual or the appearance. You always want to make sure that you can address any types of conflict of interest, because that's the last thing you want to happen to get this procurement thrown completely out because there is a conflict of interest. Now, in some cases that I have noted down here on the bottom is that an agency may sit on a solicitation for longer than they should have. So time constraint would not be considered a factor. And here's what I mean by that. Let's just say that this particular award is for 12 months, a year. Okay, and based on whatever has happened in your organization, whether we're going to get to this solicitation, but let's just say after 6 or 8 months have passed, then we realize that we need to get this solicitation out on the street, or we run the risk of sending money back to the federal agency. Okay, that would not be a sufficient reason for the delay of moving forward with the solicitation process. So please keep that in mind, that, a time constraint, especially if it was created on the grantee side, would not be a reason for going sole source. Contracting do's and contracting don'ts. These are some things from the federal perspective that you always want to make sure that you're either doing or not doing when you're putting solicitations out on the street for various types of equipment. So the do's, like I started off, you always want to compete, okay? Let the market do what it does best by having people to compete for your business, okay? Prepare an IFB or RFP, or an invitation for bid, or request for proposal. Now, when you're talking about an invitation for bid, your agency is not 100% sure as to the actual item that they're actually looking for. So by putting that solicitation out there on the street, allowing people to compete and explain to you why their product is what you actually need, is known as an invitation for bid. You're not 100% sure of what you need, so you're relying on other people to tell you what you actually need based on the information that you provided in the solicitation. Or a request for proposal. Now you actually know what it is that you are looking for, so you put that out there on the street. And in most cases, when we're dealing with a request for proposal and we know what it is that we're actually looking for, then once we get all of these proposals back, then in most cases, if every vendor has met the specs that was in that particular solicitation, then you should be required, or in most cases, we always say that you should choose the lowest bid, okay? In some cases, I've seen where, although all of the responses were right on the money in reference to what the agency was looking for. But one person that was on the committee reviewing these proposals preferred one entity over another. So that should not be the case, and that's why they say that if everyone is capable of doing or performing the task that was in the solicitation that you put out on the street, then the winner of that particular contract should be the one that presented or provided the lowest bid. Maintain a bidders list, and please keep your bidders list up to date, because again, based on vendors coming into the market and those leaving, you always want to make sure your list is up to date. Conduct interviews. So again, when we're talking about invitation for bids or request for proposal, there may be times where you have to do interviews. So again, with invitations for bids, agencies are telling you what it is that you really are looking for, because you're saying that you're not sure. So you're going to want to meet with them and get more information, because again, maybe the invitation for bid that was put out there is not truly what you're actually looking for. And then again, for the request for proposal, in most cases, if you have multiple vendors that are actually meeting all of the specs, then you tell them based on everybody meeting the spec, and you don't give away what those actual prices are, and you say that based on that, you want you to come back with your best and final offer. So again, based on that dialogue, make sure you conduct those interviews to get drill down to the best quality equipment that you actually need. Obtain all or any prior approvals that you may need. So again, remember what I talked about that sole source threshold of $250,000 or more. So if I'm dealing with a vendor and that amount exceeds that for sole source, I need to make sure that I get prior approval. Make documentations available, and here what I'm talking about is when I'm doing either a site visit or in order to approve any type of sole source, make sure that the funding source has all the documentation that they need. The don'ts that you don't want to engage in is place unreasonable requirements on a vendor, okay? Require unnecessary experience, engage in non-competitive pricing, or engage in organizational conflicts, and require unreasonable time frames. When I look at the last one, unreasonable time frame, this is the one that I mentioned on the last slide about the note. Because an organization may have dragged their feet on a particular solicitation getting out on the street. So now that you have to do the competitive bidding, you don't want to have a vendor say, well, if you're not able to perform this within a month, 2 months, whatever the case is, then we can't use you. So again, don't place unreasonable time frames on any vendor. So those solicitations or those that information should go out in a timely manner to give you time to interview and review the information that's coming back to you. With all procurements, it is a requirement that all recipients look at the list of parties that have been excluded from doing business with the federal government, okay? You can go to the SAMS.gov website. You want to go to the list of parties that have been excluded from federal procurement and place that vendor's information into the window in order to see whether or not anything comes back. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about here is that once you go to SAMS.gov, you put in, and let's say, for example, you type in my name, Michael Williams, okay? If the system brings nothing back, then that means that I am not on the list of excluded parties that can't do business with the federal government. And that is what you want to happen before you pass federal dollars onto another entity. Now, a lot of auditors are looking at confirmation from grantees as to whether or not they have looked on this particular website. So you may want to print that sheet or that page off of the SAMS.gov website and put it in the official file folder. So if anyone questions you that did you do the upfront research first, then you can provide that particular documentation to them. So again, based on their telephone number or frequently asked questions, you can reach out to the SAM.gov people and ask them various types of questions or get additional information. Now, I wanted to take some time here to go over some updates in the uniform guidance in reference to procurement. There were several updates listed in the uniform guidance, but there were a few that were specific to procurement. So I've listed them here and I'll talk about them or go over with you right quick. So the first change is 200.320. What OMB did here was to reclassify the different types of procurement to make it a lot more manageable so that you could right off the bat determine what type of procurement you are actually dealing with. So as you can see here, they say that there are now 3 types. So you're either doing an informal method of procurement, a formal method of procurement, or non-competitive method. So when we talk about informal, we're talking about micro purchases and small purchases, those amounts that are basically under a certain dollar threshold. When we're talking about the formal method, we're talking about sealed bid and those proposals. Remember what I talked about earlier, the IFP and the RFP, those invitation for bids and the request for proposal. So those are what they're considering more formal. So if you're doing either one of them, it's considered formal. And then last but not least, the non-competitive or the sole source that I've just talked about. So one of the things that's not all of that new is that non-federal entities now can establish, well, this part is new, but the micro purchase increased about 2 years ago to an amount of $10,000. So an organization could do what is considered a micro purchase as long as that amount was $10,000 or less. The caveat here now that OMB did with the micro purchase is that they're saying that now an entity can have a micro purchase in excess of the current FAR or the Federal Acquisition Regulations current threshold. So you can have one higher than $10,000. So they're saying that now you can have one up to $50,000. You can do what they consider you're self-certifying an amount in excess of the $10,000. The thing that you have to keep in mind that if you're going to have a micro purchase in excess of the FAR, that you must annually self-certify this, and you must provide the supporting documentation that's outlined in this section that's required if you're going to exceed or up to $50,000. The next change was 200.322, the domestic preference. Now, this one here is actually new, okay? All they did was push it down, and I'm not going to try to remember what it was. But this one is new, and it's actually saying that all non-federal entities should, and when I use the term should, and OMB or the uniform guidance basically is saying the same thing, and this is where I'm getting the language from, where it says that an entity should, when you see the word should in the uniform guidance or anywhere, it's basically the best practices that the federal government or other agencies are using. But then they went a little step further and they said, to the greatest extent practical, under federal awards, that entities should provide a preference in their procurement process, whether they are purchasing, acquiring, or getting goods and services, materials, product. The idea here now is, to the extent practical, you want to make sure that those materials were produced in the United States. Now, the last sentence here may not apply to everyone that's on this call when we're talking about the body-worn camera program, but this is also something that trickles down if you're ever passing awards to another agency. And also, when we're talking about contracts, this information, you want to make sure that, and this is another factor that you're looking at in making that final decision, whether or not the contractor is dealing or their materials have been produced in the United States, okay? So if you're passing awards down to another entity that's implementing an aspect of the grant subawards, then that language needs to also be in that particular agreement with the subrecipient. At this time, I'll turn it over to John. John wants to go over some programmatic aspects of the body-worn camera program.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for providing that. I think the general framework of the federal procurement process. So we didn't get into a lot of details about the particulars of body-worn cameras. I think we know that for our grantees, the majority of the purchases and the majority of the budget items relate to the purchase or lease of body-worn cameras. However, that's not exclusively the case. It depends on the individual agency. They may be doing contracts for various things, such as upgrading their network system and so forth. But I think by and large, we're talking about the purchase of the cameras as being the primary expense. I think just keep in mind those thresholds discussed in this session that Michael pointed out. If you do have questions, I think this is, the guidelines are great, but I think there's a lot of detail and nuance to them. And I would say that our body-worn camera vendors don't necessarily make it easy. For a request for proposals, you're not always comparing apples to apples. They configure the pricing differently for cameras, particularly if they're bundling it with services or storage or other things. It's hard to say, to do a side-by-side cost comparison, but I think the caveat, that it be an open, fair competition and you document your rationales for making your decisions. So there may be cost benefits in and outside of the actual, initial cost of your cameras. Let's say you're purchasing them. You may incur savings because the cameras integrate well with your dashboard camera system. There may be savings there. There may be savings in terms of how you share your data with the prosecutor. So it gets very complex. And I think that's to say that we're not going to provide you simple, easy answers or a cookbook approach here. I think you have the general framework of understanding the federal framework. So I would suggest, as always is the case, is that your first step should be to go to your federal or to go to your state policy advisors. So that's Tamara White for states A through G, or for Gerardo Velasquez for states H through W. He also is the SPA for a territory. So remember, we're here to help. So if you have particular questions about the procurement process, we'll get an answer for you. We may talk to Michael and his shop to dive deeper into that question, but we're here to help you get to that final answer. Okay, that's just a reminder of who your federal procurement officers are. And Darius LaCicero, he's sort of my counterpart on the program side. I'm on the policy side, so I'm kind of day-to-day working with CNA and the other TTA providers and implementing the program, and working closely with Darius tomorrow and Gerardo. But they're really the points of contact for anything to do with the procurement process, anything to do with really your financial management. A reminder, as we did today, we'll be holding virtual office hours tomorrow from 11 o'clock to noon, along with the staff from our Just Grant staff. So just keep that in mind. So I think we wanted to leave ample time for questions. I know this is very confusing stuff, so maybe it may be that you don't have questions at the ready, but if you ponder those, please reach out to us with the questions. I did have a couple questions that I'm going to ask Michael on my own, but Jessica or Emily, have there been any questions that have come in?
We haven't had any questions, but I do have just one poll that I can.
Yep, please. I think this will be helpful in sort of understanding where you are. If many of you have already navigated this, then we're ahead of the game. But I think some of you are still in the process of making your procurement decisions.
In fact, actually, while we are waiting, we did have one question. Let's see. So it says, what if you are an agency that already has a body-worn camera program in place with a specific vendor and is applying or looking to apply, but would seek to expand with the current vendor? If they were awarded funding, would they need to get BJA approval to continue to enhance their program with that specific vendor to ensure compatibility?
Michael, can you weigh in on that?
And I can. And I think I kind of alluded to that earlier, is that, when you're dealing with the same vendor over and over again, for the most part, I don't think that there's a problem with that, because remember some of the things that I talked about in reference to this particular entity knowing what your agency needs because they've dealt with you in the past. So if, they dealt with you last year and based on funding that's coming this year, you want to continue to use that same vendor, I don't think that, from a federal perspective, I don't think that that's a problem. And I think I talked to John earlier saying that they have multiple body-worn vendors out there in order for you to choose from. So as long as it's one of them, I don't think that that's a problem, and I'll let John weigh in on that. But the thing to keep in mind, and I talked about that earlier, is that you don't want, I say you don't want to continue to go to the same vendor year in and year out, because maybe another vendor could provide some other types of cost savings that John talked about earlier. By switching to another vendor, there could be some cost savings. So I never want a grantee to get so comfortable with one vendor that it's like they have blinders on and they won't look to see what else is out there that could possibly be more beneficial to them. John?
Yeah, I think, there's, in the particular area of body-worn cameras, I think there's a bit of a cost involved, both just a direct cost perhaps, and also just in indirect cost, shifting experience between vendors, whether the data will be compatible and transferable. So there is, I think, an incentive built in to the way that body-worn cameras operate, and that switching vendors carries a cost besides the direct cost of what it costs to purchase or lease those cameras. So I think that would be part of their documentation process, and just saying that for this variety of reasons, including these direct costs and indirect costs, it's in the benefit of our agency to continue with this vendor, because otherwise it would mean that we'd have to switch out vendors, or that we might have to pay for services for data conversion or something like that. So I won't get into the weeds of all the different vendors out there and the vendor models. And frankly, I don't know because I'm not in the field. I don't know if any of our TTA providers want to weigh in on what I said.
John, there was just one other question that kind of went off what you were saying by one of our participants in the chat that then said, would you then make the case that it would be inefficient and ineffective to select a vendor whose technology would not integrate with your current information system or technology infrastructure? Either of those issues with technology infrastructure integration and integration with current information systems could result in additional expenses.
Yeah, I think that's an eloquent way of putting it. I think that, the cost of integration and avoiding having to incur those costs with a switch would be part of the rationale for staying with the same vendor. So, Michael, I just had a couple questions for you. I think you said that $5,000 is the market value for equipment and with a useful life of a year or more. So I think the body worn cameras are supposed to last more than a year. But so if let's say that one of our grantees was looking to buy 10 cameras at the price of $500 each, would that qualify as equipment based on the number of cameras, or is it each individual camera that $5,000 threshold applies to?
And very good question. And when you're looking at items, and that's why I tried to, when I started off, I tried to do the federal definition, okay? So when we're looking at equipment, we're looking at, I'm going to say individual items. It's always important to break down any type of equipment to its lowest component.
Okay.
And I'll give an example of what I mean because of the federal definition, because again, I'm looking at how the agency's policy and procedures are crafted as to how they identify equipment. So let's take a workstation that has a mouse, a keyboard, a monitor in a package that could exceed the federal acquisition threshold of $5,000. But if you break it down to its lowest components, separate out the keyboard, the mouse, and the monitor, no one individual item should exceed the $5,000 threshold. So based on your agency's policy for identifying equipment, and in this case it's cameras, and they're $500 each, then they would not be considered equipment based on the federal agency's definition. But again, remember what I said, based on an agency's size, equipment for them could be something as low as $250. So again, I would first start on looking at the agency's definition for equipment. But from a federal perspective, $500 for cameras would not be considered equipment. Having a useful life of more than 1 year, then I think that now it's the agency's responsibility along with the program office responsibility as to how are we going to track this, okay, over its useful life.
Thanks. And I would say the other thing, Michael said that I think he chose his words carefully about, he wouldn't say that the federal government frowns on sole source procurements, but just keep in mind those thresholds that apply for prior approval. And, it's always preferable to make sure that you do fair and open competition. And I know, in fact, that, we do have through the TTA provider to sort of help you walk through that. We do have an RFP template. I don't think we'd be doing too many IFBs based on the nature of the business of the body-worn cameras. But the RFP is a good way to get input from vendors. And I don't know how much the vendors are reaching out to you once they know you have a grant. I imagine that some of them are, but I think the watchword, I think that Michael stressed and that we've stressed throughout the course of the BWC program from 2015 is that there needs to be open and fair competition. So with that, I think we're about up to our time. Are there any other questions that came in, Emma?
John, there are no other questions that came in through our chat, so I just want to thank you both so much for your presentation today. Again, it'll be recorded and it'll be posted within a couple weeks on the BWC TTA website. And so if there's nothing else, then we can go ahead and go on a break for the next 10 minutes. And when we rejoin, we'll be hearing from Tom Woodmansee, Tom Kristoff, and 2 agencies, Rochester and Wichita, about using body-worn cameras to enhance field investigations. Thank you again.
Thanks, Mike, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.